Late August 1944. A cattle car shuddered to a halt somewhere in rural Texas. Inside, 19-year-old Klaus Zimmermann pressed his back against the wood, bracing himself for what he'd been told was coming. For 6 weeks, ever since Normandy, he'd tried to harden his mind for the brutality the Reich had promised. The Americans, they'd said, torture our men. They starve them. They make them build their own graves. Every propaganda reel had said the same thing. Capture means suffering. Surrender means humiliation. The metal doors screeched open. A blinding flood of sunlight poured in. Klaus flinched, throwing up a hand against the glare. He expected shouts, gun butts, snarls of English curses. Instead, there was only air. Hot, dry air carrying a smell so unfamiliar, it took him a second to name it. Bread, fresh bread. He blinked hard. Outside stood American soldiers, helmets low, rifles slung loose, their posture relaxed in a way that didn't make sense to him. No one yelled. No one hit anyone. One guard called out, his accent thick, his tone flat with routine. "Raus, raus!" "Let's go." Out. It wasn't cruelty, just boredom. Klaus's legs trembled as he climbed down the ramp. After days jammed in that wooden box, his knees barely worked. The ground felt strange, solid, not shaking. His eyes adjusted slowly, and what he saw made his stomach twist in confusion. There were buildings, actual wooden barracks with white paint. There was grass, green and swaying under the Texas sun. There were trees, and instead of snarling dogs or lines of men with whips, there was a Red Cross nurse. A woman, an actual woman, standing in the open with a metal pitcher dripping condensation. "Water," she said, offering paper cups. Klaus froze. It had to be a trick. But the soldier behind him nudged his shoulder, and he stepped forward. She poured the water. Cold, clear, real. He stared at the paper cup like it was a miracle. His hands shook. "Drink," she said again, gentle but firm. The water hit his tongue like ice and light. He swallowed too fast, choking a little, tears pricking his eyes. He hadn't tasted clean water in weeks. The line moved forward. Processing began, not with shouts or beatings, but with forms, pens, translators who stumbled through polite German, and doctors who inspected teeth and lungs with cold stethoscopes but steady hands. No one mocked them. No one hit them. No one called them animals. By the time Klaus reached the supply table, a soldier handed him a folded uniform, olive drab, with PW stenciled in white across the back. Prisoner of war. They even gave him a bar of soap and a towel. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That night, they marched into the mess hall, a massive wooden building that smelled of coffee, steam, and something rich he couldn't identify at first. Beef stew. Klaus moved through the line like a ghost, his tray shaking in his hands. A man behind the counter ladled thick brown stew onto his plate. Chunks of meat, real meat. Another added 2 slices of soft white bread. Then came coffee, hot, dark, and honest to God, real. He sat down at a long table surrounded by other Germans, all silent, all stunned. For the first minute, no one ate. They just stared at their food, waiting for the trick. Then someone took a bite, then another, and then silence gave way to quiet weeping. Klaus lifted a spoonful of stew. It burned his tongue, and he didn't care. The taste was unbelievable. Salt, fat, onions, carrots. It filled every empty space inside him that fear had carved out. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite as if it might disappear. The bread was so soft it practically dissolved in his mouth. Back home, they'd been eating coarse rye, half sawdust by now. This was luxury. He dared a glance toward the windows. Outside, American guards changed shifts, moving with unhurried ease. One laughed, slapping another on the back. Another leaned against a post, reading a magazine. They looked well-fed, healthy, confident, and suddenly, Klaus understood something bone-deep and terrible. This was the enemy they'd been told was starving. This was the nation they'd been told was on its knees. That night, he couldn't sleep. The bunk creaked beneath him as he stared at the ceiling. The camp lights outside cast long, ghostly shadows across the boards. His bunkmate below stirred and muttered something in his sleep. When the man finally sat up, Klaus saw that he was older, mid-40s, with gray threaded through his hair. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "First day?" he asked, voice low. Klaus nodded. The man smiled faintly, humorless. "Name's Otto Bauer." He reached under his mattress and pulled out something flat and worn. A Life magazine. Contraband, smuggled, probably traded through the guards. "Take a look," Otto said, handing it up. Klaus hesitated, then opened it. His breath caught. Photographs. A factory floor in Detroit. Endless rows of workers and machines. Ships under construction. Cranes lifting steel hulls like toys. Fields of wheat stretching further than he could see. "This," Otto said quietly, "is what we were really fighting." Klaus turned the pages. Numb. "They make a tank every hour," Otto continued. "Every single hour. You know how many we built in Hamburg before I was captured? 50. A month. 50. The words landed like hammer blows. Klaus closed the magazine slowly, staring at the picture on the cover. A smiling woman riveting a plane wing, her hair tied in a scarf. Rosie the riveter. He thought of Berlin, the bombed-out streets, the empty shelves, the mothers waiting in ration lines. And now, here, America. Endless, untouched, abundant. For the first time since the war began, Klaus felt something that frightened him more than the Americans ever could. He felt doubt. He whispered under his breath, "We never had a chance." Otto didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, sitting heavy between them. Outside, the crickets sang, the guards smoked, and somewhere far from home, 2 German prisoners lay awake under the Texas sky, realizing that everything they'd been told was a lie. The next morning, the routine began like clockwork. Wake-up bell at 0600. Roll call. Breakfast, oatmeal, toast, coffee. Orders posted on the bulletin board outside the main office. Klaus was assigned to Work Detail 4, supervised by Sergeant Ben Kowalski, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair streaked with gray and a scar just visible beneath his collar. His uniform was immaculate, every button gleaming. "Farm labor," Kowalski said in clipped German, reading from a clipboard. "You follow orders, you get paid script. You disobey, you go back to camp. Easy." Klaus nodded. The truck rumbled out of the compound, guards riding at the front and back. Klaus sat in the open bed, the hot wind whipping his hair, dust stinging his eyes. The landscape stretched forever. Flat plains, fences, power lines, the occasional windmill. It was a world with too much space, too much sky. Germany felt claustrophobic by comparison. Here, the land itself seemed indifferent to war. The truck slowed near a small farmhouse, white paint peeling but solid. Fields spread behind it, rows of tomato plants heavy with fruit. A woman stood on the porch. She was maybe in her 40s, hair tied back with a kerchief, sunburned arms crossed over a faded shirt. When she stepped closer, Klaus noticed her eyes, tired but alert. "Guten Morgen," she said, her accent awkward but deliberate. "I am Margaret Schreiber. You will call me Mrs. Schreiber. You work, not talk. Understand?" They nodded. She turned, showing them how to twist the tomatoes gently from their vines. "Don't bruise them," she said, pointing. "Check color. Ripe only." Her tone wasn't unkind, just matter-of-fact. By midday, sweat soaked through Klaus's shirt. His back ached. His hands stung from the acid in the tomato stems. The guards watched but didn't interfere. When the sun hit its peak, Mrs. Schreiber appeared again, this time carrying a bucket of water and tin cups. She poured for each man. No hesitation, no scorn. When Klaus hesitated, she gave him a look that said, "Drink, or you're an idiot." He drank. The water was cool from a well, tasting faintly of iron and earth. He'd never been more grateful. Lunch came in brown paper bundles. Cheese sandwiches with mustard. 1 for each man. 6 prisoners. 2 guards. 1 for her. Everyone ate the same thing. It was the first time since the war began that Klaus had seen true equality. When the workday ended, Mrs. Schreiber inspected the baskets, nodding in quiet approval. "Good," she said. "Tomorrow, same." On the ride back, Otto leaned close. "You see? She didn't treat us like prisoners. She treated us like workers she needed." Klaus stared out at the passing fields, the endless horizon glowing orange under the setting sun. "She didn't hate us," he said softly. "No," Otto replied. "They don't waste energy on hate here. They're too busy being free. Klaus said nothing, but deep down, something shifted. A small, unsteady understanding that this was the truest defeat he'd ever known. The next few mornings unfolded with almost eerie precision. Klaus woke before dawn to the clang of the mess hall bell, ate oatmeal thick as cement and coffee strong enough to strip paint, then lined up outside the barracks for roll call. He'd expected monotony to feel like punishment. Instead, it began to feel like relief, predictable, steady. After months of chaos, orders that made no sense, and artillery that fell without warning, this, standing in line under a clear Texas sunrise, felt like peace disguised as routine. Sergeant Ben Kowalski ran the morning checklists with the calm efficiency of someone who'd long ago buried his nerves. He carried his clipboard like it was a weapon, and the prisoners quickly learned that his silence wasn't cruelty. It was discipline. He didn't yell unless he had to, and he didn't have to very often. When Klaus climbed into the back of the truck each day, the air already heavy with the smell of dust and gasoline, he knew where they were headed, back to Mrs. Margaret Schreiber's farm. If the camp was a lesson in bureaucracy, her land was a lesson in humility. The tomato rows stretched wide and precise, each plant staked and tied like a soldier standing at attention. Margaret, Maggie, as the guards sometimes called her when she wasn't around, worked beside them, hands in the dirt, moving with the rhythm of someone who'd long stopped thinking about exhaustion. "Check color," she would remind them in her clipped, careful German. "Red means ready. Green means wait." Simple, yes? She never smiled when she said it, but there was no malice either. Just order. At first, Klaus and the others worked in stiff silence. They moved like men still half expecting to be struck, waiting for cruelty to fall out of the blue. But it didn't. The only thing that fell was the Texas sun, merciless and honest. By the end of each shift, the air shimmered with heat, shirts were soaked, and even the guards wiped their brows like men instead of conquerors. When the whistle blew, everyone drank from the same dented bucket, water drawn from the same well. No one thought to separate them from us. On the third day, something subtle changed. During lunch, Maggie set down a wooden crate near the field's edge. Sandwiches again, same as always. But this time, she'd sliced apple, 6 pieces, 1 for each prisoner. When Otto thanked her, in German, polite and old-fashioned, she hesitated, then nodded once. Her eyes lingered on him longer than before. Klaus caught that look. It wasn't pity, it was acknowledgement. The smallest thread of understanding between strangers who were both doing the best they could to survive a world gone mad. Later that afternoon, clouds began to gather over the horizon, heavy gray smudges that rolled closer with each passing hour. The first drops came just as they finished the last row. "Barn!" Maggie shouted, waving them toward the structure near the windmill. They ran, slipping in the red mud, laughing despite themselves as thunder cracked overhead. Inside, the barn was cool and dim, smelling of hay and old wood. For the first few minutes, they all just stood there, guards on one side, prisoners on the other, breathing hard, steam rising off their clothes. Then Otto, shaking rain from his hair, let out a laugh. A dry, rasping sound that startled everyone. "Feels like home," he said in German. Wet, gray, and miserable. One of the guards, a tall kid named McCarthy, maybe 20, smirked. "You think this is miserable, pal? You ain't seen Iowa in February." The words meant nothing to half the group, but the tone was light, teasing. The tension cracked just a little. Another guard offered cigarettes. Otto hesitated, then took one. He lit it from the guard's match. For a few minutes, they just smoked and listened to the storm pound the roof. Klaus found himself next to Sergeant Kowalski near the doorway, both watching rain turn the fields to shallow rivers. The sergeant pulled a pack of Lucky Strikes from his pocket, tapped it against his palm, and offered one without a word. Klaus hesitated, then accepted. Kowalski cupped his hands around the match, shielding the flame from the wind. Their eyes met briefly in that flickering light. For the first time, Klaus saw not a guard, but a man. They smoked in silence. Somewhere behind them, Otto began humming, a soft, old tune, the kind sung around kitchen tables back in Germany. a folk song about working in the fields and waiting for spring. Then, faintly, one of the American guards joined in. The melody matched, but the words were English. Klaus frowned, listening closer. It was the same tune, same rhythm, just different lyrics. He realized then that the song had crossed oceans long before they ever did. Otto sang louder, grinning through the smoke. The guard joined in again, and for a few strange minutes, the barn became something that didn't belong to any one country. When the rain stopped, they filed out, clothes damp and spirits unsteady. Maggie stood near the door, her hair plastered to her forehead, watching them with an expression Klaus couldn't read. "Good work," she said simply as they passed. 2 words, but they hit harder than a metal. Back at camp, the routine continued. But now, the atmosphere had changed, just slightly, like a room after a long argument finally aired out. Klaus started learning English from the guards. Little words at first: bucket, knife, bread, then phrases. He repeated them under his breath while washing his tin plate after meals. Otto teased him gently. "Learning the language of the enemy?" Klaus shrugged. "Maybe it won't be the enemy forever." The older man smiled sadly. "Careful, boy. Hope's a dangerous luxury in times like these." But the truth was, hope had already started to take root in small ways, like the tomato vines that refused to die even when the heat cracked the soil. One afternoon, when Sergeant Kowalski arrived for inspection, Klaus noticed something different. The sergeant didn't bark orders. Instead, he paused beside one of the prisoners, a man with a limp named Eric, and asked, "How's the leg?" Eric blinked in surprise. "Better," he stammered in German. Kowalski nodded once and moved on. It was nothing, a single question, but it spread through the barracks that night like wildfire. The American sergeant cared. Not much, not openly, but enough to ask, enough to remember. And in a world where remembering someone's pain was rarer than mercy, that mattered. By late September, the fields had begun to change. The tomatoes were nearly done, replaced by dry vines and brittle stalks. Maggie began preparing her land for winter, clearing ditches, repairing fences, stacking hay in neat squares near the barn. The work detail stayed the same 6 prisoners, the same guards, the same rhythm of labor and silence. Only now, the silence was comfortable. One morning, as they gathered tools from the truck, Maggie called out to Klaus in slow, careful English. "You, come here." He obeyed, heart pounding, unsure if he'd done something wrong. She pointed to a broken fence post near the gate. "Fix this." "Yes, ma'am," he said in equally careful English. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good." When he finished, she inspected his work, nodding once in approval. "Strong," she said. "Better than last man who fixed it." Klaus felt absurdly proud, like a schoolboy being praised for neat handwriting. He realized, with quiet shock, that her approval mattered to him. At lunch, she handed him his sandwich personally. "Danke," he said out of habit. "You're welcome," she replied softly. From the corner of his eye, Klaus saw Sergeant Kowalski watching the exchange. The sergeant's expression was unreadable, not angry, not amused, just thoughtful. That evening, back at camp, the guards screened a movie in the rec hall, an American Western called Stagecoach. They allowed prisoners to attend as part of morale efforts, though guards lined the walls with rifles slung casually across their shoulders. The film flickered to life on a white sheet hung from rafters. Klaus sat beside Otto, watching in fascination. Cowboys, deserts, gunfights, everything exaggerated but strangely beautiful. When John Wayne appeared on screen, Otto nudged him. "Your twin brother," he whispered. Klaus rolled his eyes but laughed anyway. Halfway through the movie, something happened that Klaus didn't expect. The Americans and Germans laughed at the same joke. A loud, genuine laugh that echoed through the hall. For the first time, Klaus realized they weren't so different. They all wanted the same things: food, laughter, a few hours where war didn't exist. After the credits, the lights came up, and Sergeant Kowalski stood near the exit, arms crossed. As the prisoners filed out, he met Klaus's eyes. For a second, neither said anything. Then the sergeant gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement, mutual understanding. Back in the barracks, Klaus lay awake again. He stared at the ceiling and thought of Maggie's tired eyes, Otto's quiet humor, the way Kowalski had shielded the match from the rain so he could light his cigarette. All the things they'd been told about monsters, torturers, savages, it all felt so absurd now. The truth was simpler. The Americans weren't angels, but they were human, and maybe that was what made it so hard to bear. Because once you saw your enemy's humanity, you couldn't unsee it. You couldn't hate them the same way anymore. The first chill of autumn crept into Texas before Klaus even realized summer had ended. Mornings began crisp, the kind of cold that made your breath visible and your bones ache. The tomato fields were bare now, their vines dry and broken, and the men spent their days mending fences and stacking bales under Maggie's instructions. It was a Thursday morning when everything changed. Breakfast had been the usual: watery eggs, bread, coffee that tasted more like smoke than beans. The camp clerk, a balding corporal with nicotine-stained fingers, stood near the door holding a stack of envelopes. He began reading out names in a lazy monotone. Most went unanswered. Then, Zimmermann, Klaus. Klaus froze mid-sip. His cup clattered against the table, spilling coffee down his sleeve. Otto looked up from his tray, brow furrowed. "Go, boy," he said quietly. "It's from home." The clerk tossed him the envelope. Red Cross markings, German handwriting, his aunt's handwriting. The air around him seemed to still as he tore it open. The first sentence was polite, careful, the way people wrote when they didn't know how to start a tragedy. "I pray this letter finds you safe wherever you are." Then the words turned heavier. "Soviet advance, village destroyed. His mother and sisters, Greta, 16, and little Hannah, 11, missing, presumed dead. The house gone. Everything gone." His aunt had survived only because she'd been visiting cousins 2 villages over. She was sorry, so sorry. She hoped he was well. She hoped, wherever the Americans had taken him, he would find kindness. That last line broke him. Klaus read it 3 times, then folded the paper with trembling fingers and put it in his pocket. He stood up, barely aware of Otto calling after him, and walked straight out of the mess hall. The morning air was sharp, but he didn't feel it. He walked past the barracks, past the laundry line, past the fence where the American flag rippled lazily in the wind. He didn't stop until he reached the far edge of the compound, where the barbed wire met open fields, and sank to the ground. For the first time since his capture, Klaus cried. Not quietly, not controlled, full, choking sobs that tore through him like shrapnel. When Otto found him an hour later, Klaus was sitting in the dirt, staring at nothing. Otto didn't ask. He just sat beside him in silence, old hands folded, waiting. Finally Klaus spoke, his voice hoarse. "They told us the Soviets were animals," he said. "They told us the Americans were monsters. They told us we were protecting our families." He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "My mother is dead because we lost. But maybe she would be dead anyway if we'd won. What was it all for, Otto? What did any of it mean?" Otto didn't answer. There wasn't one. He just placed a hand on Klaus's shoulder and let the silence speak. Klaus stopped eating. At first, the guards thought it was defiance. Then they realized it was despair. He skipped roll call, skipped meals, skipped work. When Sergeant Kowalski came to collect him for field duty, Klaus didn't even look up. He was transferred to an isolation cell, a narrow room with a single cot and no window, only a vent that rattled whenever the wind blew. The guards checked on him 3 times a day. He never responded. On the 3rd day, Sergeant Kowalski delivered the tray himself. He set it on the floor just inside the door. Stew, bread, coffee gone cold, and waited. Klaus didn't move. "You going to eat?" the sergeant asked. Silence. Kowalski sighed, sitting down on the floor just outside the bars. "Didn't think so." He leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind humming through the vent. Finally, Kowalski began talking, not to Klaus exactly, more to the empty room. "My brother," he said, "wanted to be a teacher, history. Used to write me letters about all the stuff he'd teach someday, how people make the same mistakes over and over, and maybe if we understood history better, we'd stop being so damn stupid." He laughed softly, the sound rough around the edges. "Last letter I got from him, he said he was scared. Said he didn't want to die before he did something that mattered. Klaus turned his head slightly. He died on Omaha Beach, Kowalski continued. Shot by someone who probably didn't want to be there either. Someone with a mother waiting for a letter, too. Silence again. I spent 2 months wanting to kill every German I saw, the sergeant said. Wanted to make you all pay for taking my little brother away. Then I spent a month watching you idiots work in that field, watching Otto talk about his daughters, listening to you all try to figure out how the world got turned upside down. He paused, rubbing his temples. War doesn't choose who deserves to grieve, kid. We all just lose. That's the only fair thing about it. Then he stood up, picked up the untouched tray, and left. Days blurred together. Klaus didn't know how long he stayed in that cell. He dreamt in fragments, his mother's voice, the sound of Maggie's well bucket clanging against stone, Otto laughing in the rain. Then one morning, the door opened again. Kowalski stepped in, holding a clipboard. I'm pulling you out, he said. Work detail starts tomorrow. Klaus blinked, disoriented. Why? Because sitting here, you're just dying slower. Kowalski scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page. That help anybody? He left before Klaus could answer. The next day, the truck rolled out of camp with the same familiar rattle, and Klaus climbed into the bed with the others, Otto, Eric, and 4 more. No one spoke, but Otto clapped him on the shoulder as if to say welcome back. The Texas landscape slid by, fields gold and brittle, windmills creaking under an endless blue sky. When they arrived at Maggie's farm, she was waiting at the gate. She looked older, more worn than before, but when she saw Klaus step off the truck, her face softened. Welcome back, she said in careful German. Klaus nodded mutely. The work was quiet that day, repairing the barn roof, clearing out ditches, simple labor that let the mind drift. The rhythm of motion, the scrape of shovels, the smell of dry grass, it grounded him in a way nothing else had. At lunch, Maggie brought sandwiches as usual, but this time she also carried a small wrapped bundle. She placed it in the middle of the table. Inside was a cake, chocolate, uneven, but clearly homemade. The men stared, speechless. My husband, Maggie said softly, believed people are just people. The uniform doesn't change that. She cut the cake carefully, dividing it into 7 equal slices, 6 prisoners, 1 for herself. He would have wanted this. She handed the first piece to Klaus. He hesitated, then took it. The frosting stuck to his fingers. It smelled like cocoa and sugar, like memory. He took a bite, and the world cracked open. It tasted like his mother's baking. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, everything he'd lost in a single sweet, unbearable mouthful. Tears came before he could stop them. Otto looked away, giving him privacy. Across the table, Maggie spoke again, almost in a whisper. When my husband died, they sent me his letters. In one, he wrote, "If they ever send German boys here, treat them kindly." They didn't start this. The barn went silent. Even the guards said nothing. After a moment, Otto spoke, his voice rough but steady. We never had a chance, he said. Not because your soldiers were stronger, but because you never stopped seeing us as human. No one replied. There was nothing to add. They finished the cake in silence. 7 people connected by loss, and the faint, fragile mercy of decency. That night, back at camp, Klaus couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet, except for the soft snores and shifting bodies of tired men. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the taste of chocolate still faint on his tongue. He thought of his mother, of Maggie, of Otto, of Sergeant Kowalski, lighting his cigarette in the rain. He thought about the impossible contradiction of it all, how the same country that had killed his family could also be the one showing him compassion. It was unbearable and beautiful all at once. When sleep finally came, it brought no dreams, only a strange, heavy peace. Autumn deepened, the days shortened, the light taking on that golden, melancholy hue that makes everything look older. The Texas wind carried the dry scent of dust and wood smoke. By November, the fields were stripped bare, and the harvest was over. Life settled back into the uneasy rhythm of waiting for letters, for news, for the war to end. But outside the camp, the patience of ordinary people was wearing thin. Word had spread about Maggie Schreiber's farm. about how she had enemy laborers, and worse, how she treated them well. Someone in town saw her sharing water with the POWs and whispered that she'd lost her loyalty along with her husband. Someone else said she was feeding the enemy while our boys starve overseas. By the time Sergeant Kowalski heard the rumors, they'd already grown teeth. It started small. One morning, Maggie found the word traitor scrawled across her barn in red paint. She scrubbed it clean herself, jaw set, back straight. The next week, someone slashed all 4 of her truck's tires in the night. She didn't report it, just borrowed from her dwindling savings to buy second-hand replacements. Then came the brick through her kitchen window, a note wrapped around it. "You're feeding killers while our sons die." Maggie swept up the glass in silence. The next day, she boarded the window shut and kept working. When Ben delivered the week's labor schedule to the camp, Maggie's name wasn't on it. "Schreiber Farm canceled until further notice," the clerk muttered. "Guess she's done with them." Ben said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He gathered the papers and left. That evening, he found Otto near the barracks steps. The older man had a way of reading faces. One glance, and he understood. "She's in trouble, isn't she?" Otto asked quietly. Ben didn't answer. He didn't need to. Otto looked toward the fence where the sun was setting behind the guard towers, casting long shadows. "We were bound to remind them of what they lost," he said. "Can't blame them for hating the reminder." Inside the barracks, Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the letter from his aunt. The edges were soft now from handling. He kept reading it, hoping the words might change. They never did. He had heard the whispers, too, about Maggie's farm, about the brick, about how kindness had turned dangerous again. Otto had visited him in isolation once before, speaking through the bars. "It's all falling apart," he'd said. "Fear's winning again." Now, that fear had spread like a fever. When the guards came for the morning roll call, Klaus didn't move. The thin routine of hope that had been stitched into his days, the farm work, the laughter, the small bits of shared humanity, had unraveled completely. He'd started to think maybe Otto was wrong. Maybe the war had already won, no matter how many fences or flags separated victors from the defeated. That afternoon, Sergeant Kowalski returned to his office to find a memo waiting. Major Hartley's handwriting was neat, measured, bureaucratic. Subject: conduct with POWs. Sergeant, recent reports indicate inappropriate familiarity between guards and prisoners. Remember, the Geneva Convention requires humane treatment, not friendship. Maintain discipline. Hartley Ben read the note twice, then folded it and slid it into a drawer. He stared at the wall for a long moment before standing up, grabbing his hat, and walking toward the isolation block. Klaus was sitting on the cot, eyes unfocused, that same folded letter clutched in his hands. Ben sat down on the floor outside the bars and unwrapped a sandwich from his pocket. "You planning to talk today?" "Nothing." He took a bite, chewed slowly, then said, "My brother was 21. Wanted to be a teacher. History. Smartest kid I ever met." Still silence. "He wrote me a letter before D-Day. Said he was scared. Said he didn't want to die before he did something that mattered." Ben looked down at the sandwich in his hand. "I got the telegram in July. Said he was killed on Omaha Beach." He took another slow bite, chewing the words as much as the bread. "For a while I hated every German I saw. Made it simple. You killed him, so I hate you. Math even a dumb sergeant can do." Finally, Klaus turned his head. His eyes were hollow, but he was listening. "Then I watched you in that field," Ben continued. "Watched Otto talk about his girls. Anna and Sophie, right? Watched you all working like you were trying to rebuild something you didn't even believe in anymore." He set the sandwich aside. "War doesn't choose who deserves to grieve, kid. We all just lose." The words hung there in the air between them, simple and heavy. Klaus swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, raw. "You still hate us?" he asked finally, his voice cracking. Ben shook his head. "No, just tired." They sat in silence for a while. Not absolution. Not forgiveness. Just two men who'd both lost too much. The next morning, Ben made a decision that could have cost him his rank. He filled out the paperwork to return Klaus to work detail, signing his own name on the authorization line. When Major Hartley raised an eyebrow, Ben said flatly, "The kid needs to work." Sitting in that cell, he's just dying slower. That help anybody? Hartley stared at him for a moment, then sighed. This is on you, Sergeant. Ben nodded. Yes, sir. Klaus returned to the barracks that night, thinner and paler, but alive. Otto greeted him with a crooked smile and a chess set someone had carved out of scrap wood. Sit, he said. You don't get to quit. None of us do. That's what living means now. They played in silence, each move deliberate, each pause heavy with the things neither dared to say. Meanwhile, the town began to shift. It started with one woman, Eleanor Patterson, who lived 3 farms over. She stood in her kitchen one night, staring at the casserole she'd made for the church social. She thought about Maggie eating alone in that boarded-up farmhouse, thought about her own son, Robert, fighting somewhere in the Pacific. She imagined what it would be like if he were captured, if someone else's kindness was the only thing keeping him human. She wrapped the casserole in a towel, got in her truck, and drove. Maggie answered the door with suspicion etched deep into her face. Eleanor didn't say much, just held out the dish. I'm sorry about what they did, she said quietly, and I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. Maggie's hands trembled as she took it. Why now? Because I'm tired, Eleanor said simply. Tired of pretending that cruelty makes us righteous. She turned and left before Maggie could answer. The next Sunday, 2 more neighbors came by with pies, then 3 more the following week. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to remind Maggie she wasn't completely alone. By late October, the farm appeared again on the labor roster. The war still raged across oceans and continents, but here, in this small corner of Texas, something fragile had survived. When the truck arrived, Maggie was waiting at the gate. Her face looked drawn, her hands lined and rough, but her eyes were steady. Welcome back, she said in German. The words carried weight, not ceremony, not forgiveness, but endurance. They went back to work, repairing fences, clearing the last of the fields for winter. The rhythm was the same, but quieter, as if everyone understood how precarious peace could be. At noon, Maggie called them over for lunch. Sandwiches as before, distributed evenly, but this time she brought out something else, a cake, chocolate, dark and rich, with real sugar. Klaus could see the ration stamps it must have cost her. She sliced it carefully. My husband would have wanted this, she said softly. Heinrich believed that people are just people. The uniform doesn't change that. She handed the first plate to Klaus. He took it with shaking hands, eyes stinging. The taste was sweet, familiar, devastating. For a moment, the war disappeared. Otto looked around the table, at Maggie, at the guards, at the young men who had once believed themselves invincible, and said quietly, "We never had a chance. Not because your soldiers were better, because you never stopped seeing us as human." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the wind moving through the barn rafters. They ate in silence. Guards, prisoners, and a widow who had lost everything but her dignity. And for a few stolen minutes, peace felt real. Outside, the world was still on fire, but in that barn, under that roof, humanity had survived. And that was victory enough.